Okay, hello and welcome everyone. So in this video, I'm going to provide an introduction to behavioral economics of a particular sort. I'll talk about that in a second. This tends to be the second or third, but in this case, the second lecture in my ethics and economic behavior course. So the course is basically looking at the interdisciplinary applications of economics and philosophy, in particular ethics. So the first lecture, it's also a writing intensive course. The first lecture is around good writing in economics. Second lecture is this one, so thinking about some foundations in behavioral economics. Then the third goes into applicate or sort of foundation of ethics, and then kind of some more foundational lectures before approaching interesting topics. What I do in this lecture, I should say first, here's my dog, Onyx. Onyx has a stick. This means way more to me than it will to you at this point in time, so kind of ignore that. It's a little bit of like code to myself so that when I look back that I know what's going on in this video. Also, so as I'm thinking about behavioral economics here, I'm following along from Cartwright 2011. I'll show you that I'll show you that where you can get that book or which that book is. That is here. This is actually the third edition. I should probably buy this because this is like a 2018 edition. I have the 2011 edition, which must have been the first edition. So I should probably get this. And I probably had like the first or second edition on the syllabus, and now here's the third. If I remember, I'll update it to be the third edition. Anyway, so my introduction to behavioral economics is following from this text. And the reason why I like this one, it's like the first portion of the book. And the reason why I like this is because people come in thinking a whole bunch of things about behavioral economics, and this gives both an interesting historical background. Also, it helps position your perspective on the contributions of behavioral economics to our thinking more generally in a way that's super helpful as we go through the course. And so that's why I do this instead of like doing a crash course in behavioral economics. I give you this sort of foundation, and then we'll introduce those other ideas kind of as we go along. All right. So the other thing is, scrolling down here, we see the frequently bought together. So we have some books by Richard Thaler. Well, Richard Thaler and then Cass Sunstein. So Richard Thaler, University of Chicago, Cass Sunstein, University of Chicago. Richard Thaler won Nobel Prize, and then Misbehaving is, two books here that are sort of really interesting, making, behavioral economics accessible to kind of more of a popular audience. Of these two, like if you're interested in buying, these books here is kind of like learning about behavioral economics, I'd recommend Misbehaving first, Nudge second. We'll talk about the ideas from Nudge in the course, and there's some really interesting applications. Those get reflected in Misbehaving. Misbehaving is actually like a little bit better sort of broadly thinking about behavioral economics, and some little bit more of like applications that are relevant for this course. I thought about putting it on the syllabus as like an additional book, but I don't want to kind of distract people or, kind of have you buy a whole bunch of books, since I actually don't want to require a book. I kind of want to kind of introduce the content as needed and then make it largely self-contained. Nudge is an interesting book. The first half was super interesting. The second half, not as much to me. In all honesty, I didn't make it through. So it's based around a lot of Thaler's work, which is interesting. Some of it more interesting to me than others. The second half gets a lot more into like finance type things, and that's pretty far from my area of interest. And so unfortunately, I got really bored at the second half of Nudge, but your mind might be wired differently. All right. We get rid of Onyx, at least for the time being. So here's the motivating quote, both from Cartwright book, but then also, I think, for the course, not even just this lecture, which is, however beautiful the strategy, you should occasionally look at the results. So the idea is, we've got this beautiful theory to describe economic behavior. We should look at how it's performing. We should look and see, does it do well? Turns out economic theory actually does surprisingly well. Although you might have models that fail to predict well. There's some reasons why it might fail to predict well. Could be that you're trying to forecast. That's difficult to do because you don't know when there's going to be a pandemic. Could be that your model is just inappropriate for the underlying phenomena. Anyway, either way, you should look and see, how's the model performing? Like, how's your theory performing? All right, so what is behavioral economics? Cartwright offers a couple of different answers and then goes into depth discussing each. So the first one is, behavioral economics is about understanding economic behavior and its consequences. It's about understanding why somebody buys a hot dog, goes to work, saves for retirement. Thaler's got some really interesting work around saving for retirement. Why gives to charity. One of the professors that I had for behavioral economics at the University of Arizona, Anna Bremen, has a really interesting paper on giving to charity that's sort of motivated from some of Thaler's work. So you could look, I think it was Give More Tomorrow. I think Thaler's paper was Save More Tomorrow, and Anna Bremen's paper was Give More Tomorrow. Super interesting. Maybe I'll bring it up in the class. Gets a qualification, sells an old car, gambles on a horse race, can't quit smoking. It's about understanding whether people make good or bad choices and could be helped to make better choices. I mean, it's a super broad definition. You could tell. I got distracted reading through it, right? So, I mean, it's a lot of different things. Behavioral economics is everywhere, all around us, but so is economics. And so maybe this isn't sort of a really good definition of behavioral economics, right? Second part. Well, as we're thinking about positioning our thinking around the contribution of behavioral economics and what it's adding, well, let's start off with a standard economic model based on some strong assumptions. First, that people can be approximated by a homo economicus. Thaler calls this individual an econ, which I prefer. So people can be approximated by an econ who's rational, calculating, selfish, with unlimited computational capacity, never makes systematic mistakes. Does it sound like anyone you know? It's me, of course. No, I mean, of course, nobody's like this, right? And so that's a problem because maybe we can approximate people with this sort of like superhuman, or I don't know, superhero powers individual, but you know, we have no right to believe that that approximation would do well. The other assumption is that market institutions work. Prices should converge to equilibrium. Again, not so obvious that they ought to, right? There's no obvious reason why humans should be approximated by econ or why markets should work. All right, so this is my comment about Thaler. What's behavioral economics? Part 2. Answer part 2. Behavioral economics is about testing the standard economic model on humans, seeing when it works, when it doesn't, whether it can be tweaked or given an overhaul or to better fit what we observe. Actually, this is where a lot of people stop with behavioral economics, and they think that, okay, well, we'll test the standard model, let's find out what's wrong with it, let's tweak it a little bit to make it work a little bit better, and then make it fit what we're observing. The problem is, well, exactly how to test and tweak the model. Another issue is like, there's a lot of places where the model can fail, right? And as you're trying to reinfuse reality into, to counterbalance one area that it doesn't do so well, you're going to have some problems in other areas. Also, you're very quickly going to get a model that's completely intractable. The other thing is, clearly we already test the standard model. We actually find it to be surprisingly flexible. It actually does pretty well. And I'll try to convince you of this. When I first introduced thinking about altruism and thinking about altruism from you typically might think of why people are altruistic. Oh, this has to involve behavioral economics. Actually, no, you can explain quite a bit of altruistic behavior from a standard economic model. And so I'll kind of challenge maybe your initial propensity to think that it necessarily requires behavioral economics. All right, answer 3. Behavioral economics is about applying insights from laboratory experiments, psychology, and other social sciences in economics. The idea here is to try to be guided by evidence on human behavior and psychology, both in testing and in tweaking the model. So the idea here is let's try to replace our econ, our homo economicus, with homo sapiens. Right, so you're trying to infuse humanity into our model, which I think is probably good since we're trying to model humans, but not in all cases, because as we'll see, it actually turns out in a lot of cases, the standard model does a pretty good job. All right, so what is behavioral economics? Well, our sort of final answer, behavioral economics is about working constructively with the standard economic model to get a better understanding of economic behavior. The goal is not to criticize the model or accentuate its negative features. The goal is to understand economic behavior as well as possible. That's the punchline. That's the key, right? The idea is not that we throw up our hands, we say we don't have any good way to be able to express or consider economic behavior. No, instead it's to say, here we've got this model, we can make it better. We're going to try to understand economic behavior as well as possible. That's another sort of goal. The course is trying to explore and understand economic behavior. Think about motivations and so on and so forth. But the goal is not to criticize the model or accentuate its negative features. Instead, you'll recognize the shortcomings, obviously, but our goal is ultimately to the end of trying to better understand economic behavior. All right, so the history of economic behavior. Well, it's difficult to say where it actually begins. Cartwright actually credits Adam Smith, and I'm really sympathetic to that view. So in A Theory of Moral Sentiments, so Smith has kind of like the two famous works that you might have, the first one is like A Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. The other one that you might have found would be A Theory of Moral Sentiments. However, Theory of Moral Sentiments is more widely read by philosophers, as far as I have encountered, than economists. But here, Smith explains that people are not motivated solely by self-interest, but feel a natural sympathy with each other and have a sense of virtue. Now, this is really interesting and sort of like a missing piece as you're thinking about Adam Smith's philosophy, right? Especially you might have, like, if you've heard of Adam Smith, you've also probably heard of Invisible Hand, and that might be all you've ever heard of, right? But you realize this is this sort of like sense of the natural sympathy with each other and sense of virtue that also might be something you might think is completely left out, because the famous passage that people know from A Wealth of Nations is talking about like is talking about, what is, I'm going to completely misquote it, so I won't try, but it's like how people it's by people kind of seeking their own interests that they collectively, I should pull it up, this is embarrassing, they collectively collectively bring about the conditions that are best as a whole. It's kind of like acting as individuals, then acting in your own self-interest ends up coming up with a mutually beneficial outcome. For some reason, as I'm thinking back, like I've got this great memory, but as I'm thinking back, trying to like remember the page and reading this, all I can think of is Russell Crowe in A Beautiful Mind as John Nash talking about how Adam Smith was wrong. And then that sequence where thinking about how the individual is acting in their own interest is important. Of course, well, A Beautiful Mind completely mischaracterizes Nash equilibrium. But anyway, important themes are reward and punishment, custom and fashion, and this shows up in A Theory of Moral Sentiments. All right, so at the beginning of the 20th century, economics turned away from psychology and behavioral economics disappeared for over 1/2 a century. So the question would be, well, if Adam Smith was the first one thinking about behavioral economics, what happened? Because Adam Smith is also kind of like the beginning of like modern microeconomic thought. Well, what happened, at least on Cartwright's reading of history, and as far as I know as well, was brought about by Vilfredo Pareto, who wrote in an 1897 letter, "Pure political economy, therefore, has great interest in relying as little as possible on the domain of psychology." Vilfredo Pareto, which is really fun to say, in 1900, Vilfredo Pareto's theory of choice holds that every psychological analysis is eliminated as the main achievement, right? So kind of pulling away psychology and boiling it down to focus not on why people do it, but on what they do. And, this kind of gave us the sort of modern view, or kind of the modern foundation for the standard economic account of economic behavior. Quotes attributed to this paper here. Pareto says, "I'm not interested in the reason why the decision maker is indifferent between one thing and another. I notice the pure naked fact." Pareto's new theory of choice seemed widely applicable in the face of such appeal and convenience. It became easy to overlook the fact that people are neither rational nor selfish. So our econ became the dominant model, and economics grew pretty distant from psychology, right? So, right, we've got this really simple model that works pretty well, and it's easy to forget that people are not always rational and are not always perfectly selfish. And so this made it easy to kind of adopt this the model. And in some sense, in fairness, in the aggregate, the assumption that people are selfish and rational does pretty well, like on average. But as we're thinking about individuals, well, sometimes the psychology matters quite a bit more. So more recently, Herbert Simon, CMU, so Carnegie Mellon, won the Nobel Prize in 1978 for pioneering research in the decision-making process within economic organizations. Right, so this is sort of bringing us back, thinking more closely about reinfusing psychology into our model of economic behavior. So Simon says, "My economist friends have long since given up on me, consigning me to psychology or some distant wasteland." So thinking back on kind of the state of the field, and then so on and so forth. So something interesting here, something interesting insight that I can provide here. I was at Carnegie Mellon for 2 years. So after leaving PhD program in Arizona, then my first job was Carnegie Mellon and University of Pittsburgh. Carnegie Mellon doesn't have an economics department. So there's economists between Tepper, which is the business school, Heinz, which is the policy school, and then SDS, Social Decision Sciences, which is an interdisciplinary type department that involves psychology and behavioral economics. And so you find economists kind of sprinkled throughout. I mean, I taught through Tepper and I taught through Heinz. I didn't have an affiliation with SDS, though I knew some of the faculty there. And actually the person who had research interests most close to mine was a philosopher, right? And indeed had done his PhD, I think at Cornell, in the math department, and was working on applications of game theory that was actually the closest of anybody in Pittsburgh to what I was doing, but had a PhD in math, was in the philosophy department at Carnegie Mellon. And so it's a really interesting environment, super interdisciplinary. And so I think that's at least part of the context for Simon's comment here, given the career at Carnegie Mellon. Anyway, so despite Simon's effort, we still lacked proof that Homo economicus was a good approximation. Lack of formal proof made work easy to ignore. Right, so what's the problem? Well, we lacked proof that Homo economicus was not a good approximation. And given that there wasn't formal proof of problems with the model, well, it made it easy to not pay full attention to what Simon was developing. So next came Kahneman and Tversky, spearheading the your assumptions are wrong attack, right? And they demonstrate people are indeed very different from Homo economicus. So this is like thinking about all the decision errors and biases. An example would be like from Thaler and Sunstein, from Nudge, I think, actually. This is you've probably read this before, or you've probably seen this example before. A bat and ball cost $1.10 total. The ball costs $1 more than the bat. How much does the bat cost? Oh, so people are going to say, what? The bat costs, ball costs $1 more than the bat. People are going to say, oh, the ball costs $1, the bat costs 10 cents. Oh, no, right? So most people answer 10 cents, but if you actually were to solve the cell, you see, oh, well, it's 5 cents, right? Yeah, $1 more, right? $1.05 plus 5 cents. $1.05 minus 5 is $1, right? All right, so Kahneman won a share of the Nobel Prize in 2002, having integrated insights from psychological research into economic science, especially concerning human judgment and decision-making uncertainty. The other share of the Nobel Prize was with Vernon Smith, who is did the majority of the Nobel Prize research at University of Arizona. Was where his lab was. Let's see. However, the attack was still too easy to dodge for economists still confident in the standard model after looking at Kahneman and Tversky's work, right? Because the real issue is whether the models in which people are approximated by Homo economicus makes good predictions, right? The early work of Kahneman and Tversky and others was largely silent on the issue, right? So they observed problems where people are subject to different types of biases, loss aversion, right? Kahneman and Tversky prospect theory. And so we have like all these interesting observations, cognitive biases, but that doesn't settle the question of whether or not the model does well. It could be that people are subject to these decision errors, but nevertheless, the model performs well, right? In the early work of Kahneman and Tversky and others was largely silent. Next comes the markets work revelation of Vernon Smith, right, who shared the Nobel Prize. Starting in 1955, Smith performed a series of experiments to see whether basic predictions of the standard model of markets would prove correct. And the stunning result was actually the markets did pretty well. So then the observation is maybe it doesn't matter so much. If individuals are like Homo economicus, the standard model can still work. So let's see. So Vernon Smith was famous for the oral double auction. Oral double auction, oral meaning like calling out prices out loud, double auction meaning buyers and sellers kind of communicating, and like auction in terms of like how we're bidding for prices. And the outcome is like through the oral double auction, you're allocating these like hypothetical items, but Vernon Smith showed in the sort of experimental in laboratory experiments, so like with students, with high school students, business exec and so on and so forth, have been tested using the oral double auction and realizing, oh wow, this actually gets pretty efficient. So these things, when you run an oral double auctions experiment, you can get efficiency upwards of 95, 96, 97, 98, 99%, right? All right. So Vernon Smith's share of the Nobel Prize was awarded for having established laboratory experiments as a tool in empirical economic analysis, especially in the study of alternative market mechanisms. So interesting thing here was, while moving beyond standard model, right, introducing like laboratory experiments, it largely confirmed the standard model is getting things right. So then the question is, why do we need behavioral economics? Maybe we don't, right? If the standard model is giving us these predictions, markets are working well, maybe we don't need behavioral economics. Well, the final element is what most people, the most important to establishing behavioral economics, it's the what equilibrium people choose problem. So we can see this on a couple different levels. In a coordination game where there's like two equilibrium, you could think of like, do we drive on the right or do we drive on the left of a road? Do we walk on the right or do we walk on the left of a hallway? Does it matter if you're in a country that drives on the right or drives on the left when you're deciding whether to walk on the left or right of a hallway, right? There's two different equilibriums. It's we walk on the right, that's a perfect equilibrium, or we walk on the left, perfect equilibrium. Same thing for driving. We've got two different equilibria to choose from. We have to choose which one is actually going to happen. So that's one thing, and there's some aspects of behavioral economics behind this. There's a different sort of idea in these contributions here. So Reinhard Selten won the Nobel Prize in '94 with John Nash and John Hersani for their pioneering analysis of the equilibrium in the theory of non-cooperative games. So basically what they're looking at is refining. So Nash introduces the Nash equilibrium, and then Reinhard Selten and John Hersani are working on sort of refinements of Nash equilibrium. So for instance, Reinhard Selten is famous for introducing the notion of subgame perfect Nash equilibrium. So in an extensive form game, this requires that players are playing consistent with Nash behavior on each subgame, right? So, and if not, subgame perfect Nash equilibrium is going to be sequentially rational. You'll pair off Nash equilibria that would require behavior that's not sequentially rational. So the basic idea is like game theory is giving us this insight into the equilibrium people choose, saying, well, of a collection of multiple equilibriums, some are kind of silly. We have to kind of get rid of some and, be a little bit more stringent on our selection criteria. What's the problem? Well, game theory looks to capture behavior in strategic situations and meant the demands on Homo economicus became even more stringent. What's the problem? All of a sudden, now we have Homo economicus that's got to be selfish, rational, and more clever than any economist and be telepathic economist. In strategic situations, it's often ambiguous what Homo economicus should do, and ambiguous what the rational thing is to do, right? And so that can be kind of a problem. And when we come up with the theoretical prediction, departing very strongly from what we might actually expect a human to be doing, now we have some problems. So Cartwright says, more than anything, I think game theory was instrumental in the rebirth of behavioral economics because it meant the next logical step in developing the standard model was to draw from psychology and use experiments. Right? All right, so now we'll explore some of the many faces of behavioral economics that Cartwright kind of tours through. And this is important for thinking about kind of the different versions or different contributions or different things to kind of think about as we're thinking of a richer model. So first we're thinking of bounded rationality, Herbert Simon. So the term bounded rationality is commonly reserved an approach where we explicitly model the constraints people face, right? So so with bounded rationality, the basic idea is we're realizing people are finite creatures, right? It's limited. We don't have unlimited memory. We don't have unlimited processing power. You can get annoyed. Emotions matter. You might be forgetful, so on and so forth. And so the idea is, well, let's not solve the problem in a way that a Homo economicus, econ, selfish, rational person would do. Let's solve the problem that the person. Let's optimize for the person who might have limited memory, which is not what's the best computer password, but what's the best computer password if I might forget it, right? So this tradition still assumes Homo economicus is a valid approximation, but we assume less memory and less math ability, which I think is reasonable in a lot of cases. 2, heuristics. Simple heuristics make us smart. So this approach starts with the idea that people use heuristics or simple guidelines to make decisions, right? So, people might use the same computer password or a slight variation for all their accounts. Don't do that. It's a bad idea, but people do, right? Because people might forget, and so how do you avoid forgetting your password? Or you use the same one for everything. And when people do this, what's the password that they use for everything? It's password, or it's password where the O is a 0 and you think you've tricked people, or password or they make you have you have to have a character, a non-alphanumeric character. So I add an exclamation point, password, and then I use it for everything. No. You have to have something more complicated. So let's just coming up with a computer pass. So I had to do a security training. I did a security training because you don't want information security training or whatever. So you have to come up with you have to be trained on how to come up with passwords that people aren't going to crack for you. Okay, so what this training company was advising us to do was, instead of having your computer password being a word or a collection of letters and numbers, no, it should be a phrase that only you will remember. And the one that they had in the example was time for chocolate. So it's time for chocolate. Okay. So that's not my password. So, all right, whether the heuristic employed is optimal is not really considered important, right? It's more important to find out what people are actually going to use and then reflect on the consequences. Right? Cognitive biases, right? The heuristic approach fits naturally within the work of psychologist Kahneman and Tversky, right? Problem is, with heuristics come biases. Sometimes the biases get more of the headlines, right? A reasonable heuristic in repetitive situations is just do what I did last time. So an example, when you're grocery shopping, you might just go to the same store. You might get status quo bias, right? Status quo bias, where the decision maker fails to change their behavior often enough. Maybe you keep going to the same store when a cheaper or better one has opened. And these biases are called cognitive biases. Sometimes status quo bias can be a problem. Other times, it's a really big time saver. And so we'll think about this in the context of, ought you be an optimizer or a satisficer? Optimizing is trying to do the best you can subject to a constraint. Satisficing is trying to take the first satisfactory alternative, right? So if you're buying paper towels, maybe you don't try to, I used to drive myself absolutely crazy when I was in I was in college, and then for the first couple of years out, because you have like student loans and you have kind of like low low income as a college student and grad student, and then in first couple of positions. And so I would sit there and I'd try to calculate what's the best deal. I'd look at, what's the volume, or what's the weight, what's the price per weight, or price per like the amount of item. And I'd be doing all this math. I'd never bring a calculator. I always do this in my head, trying to think these things out, and okay, what if I buy this combination of these things? And before you know it, you're like doing this complicated thing. It takes you a couple of minutes to figure it out and to try to optimize. If you're within a budget like I was at that time, maybe that's a good use of time. But at this point, it's just kind of like a waste of time to worry about calculating those things out. And like, my motivation, I don't care about money at all, but I want to have my one goal when it came to money, besides like being able to pay off like student loans, was to be able to get to the point where I could just buy out of habit, where I could be subject to this cognitive bias and just buy the same thing every time and not have to sit there in the store and calculate and try to optimize. And I figure at this point, like my time is more valuable than trying to calculate and try to save, 50 cents here or there. All right, experimental economics. So cognitive biases are the simplest to see in well-designed experiments. So the most common form of research in psychology is experiments. So in experiments, or in economics, however, experiments were unheard of until Vernon Smith and then Reinhard Selten. The mark experiments of Vernon Smith focus on institutions and aggregate behavior, not on individuals, right? Thinking about institutions like, thinking about supply and demand model, thinking about oral double auction. Selten focused on individuals and then theories of individual behavior. There's an interesting paper with Reinhard Selten and Martin Duffenberg, and then Jose, I can't say his name. I can probably spell it better. I could say it. Apestiguia, something like this. The paper was on. It's called "Blowing the Whistle." It was on like cartels, right? So thinking about like behavior of individual cartels in the context of a discrete Bertrand model. Within behavioral economics, there's the contrast of game theory and then bounded rationality versus experimental economics and cognitive biases, right? So we have these different branches of behavioral economics. On the one hand, good behavioral economics can actually solve theoretical research without experiments. Good behavioral economics can actually involve theoretical research without experiments, or experimental research without theory, right? So the idea is like we see these different versions of behavioral economics, but it can involve other things as well. It doesn't necessarily have to have experiments. Doesn't necessarily have to. And you can have experimental research without theory. Kind of a sort of variety of interesting things. All right, so we should also mention economic psychology, which is a subdiscipline of psychology. It deals with psychology of economic decision making. You can get into like economic psychology, like mathematical psychology. That's kind of in the Kahneman-Tversky direction. The difference between economic psychology and behavioral economics, small. Then there's behavioral finance, which is a subset of behavioral economics, deals with financial decision making, financial behavior. It's taken on a life of its own, might even be more prominent. Behavioral finance, like you'd find a lot kind of going into behavioral finance. You might find a little bit more sort of active research in behavioral finance. It might be a little, I don't know. So that's hard to say. And then neuroeconomics brings in neuroscience. So think of like fMRI imagings. And so there's a research group at Caltech that was working on neuroeconomics. All right. Debate and controversy. So first, is it enough to assume that people can be approximated by Homo economicus, or do we need assumptions grounded in psychology? So firstly, that people are not like Homo economicus is not alone sufficient reason to assume that to assume they're not like Homo economicus, right? We have to look at the predictions, right? So this is saying the fact that people are not selfish and rational doesn't necessarily mean that we can't assume that they're not selfish and rational, right? So the idea with making assumptions is that we want to be able to abstract away the complicating details and focus on what's the heart of the issue that we're interested in exploring. Like that's the point of modeling, making assumptions. Well, it could be that even though people are not actually like the Homo economicus model, the econ model, nevertheless, we can assume that they are and still be able to get the predictions that we're after. So how do we tell if this is a good assumption or a bad assumption? Well, look at the predictions of the model and compare it to the empirical evidence. Second, should emphasis be placed on things the standard economic model does well or does poorly? So, well, as an anecdote, there's the Behavioral Foundations of Economic Theory conference in 1985, where the conference organizers were stressing a growing body of evidence, mainly of an experimental nature, that documents systematic departures from the dictates of rational economic behavior. Right? So here's this conference. So for an economic conference, there'll be like a conference theme. And then, so you have like the title for the conference, and then you have like the theme, and there's some blurb about it. And then there, especially after papers and presentations that kind of focus around that theme, this probably was the theme of that conference. Vernon Smith, who was present, wished instead to stress a growing body of evidence that's consistent with the implications of rational model. Right? Remember, Vernon Smith running economic experiments, finding actually the standard model is doing pretty well, focusing on institutions and on the model as a whole. Well, those coming from economics tend to stress what the standard model does well, the predictions, not the assumptions, saying, hey, it predicts well, even if the assumptions might involve things that don't closely fit. Those coming from psychology tend to stress what the standard model does poorly, on the limitations of the assumptions. I think maybe a little bit more popular. People hear about behavioral economics, you want to think about like what economics is getting wrong, right? Now, if the assumptions of the standard model are pretty bad, but the predictions are often pretty good, we can see why there might be grounds for disagreement. Indeed, there is. So the big question is, should we look to rewrite economics from a psychological perspective, or adapt the standard model to take account of psychological insight? Right. Well, at the core of behavioral economics is the conviction that the realism of the psychological underpinnings of the economic analysis will improve economics on its own terms. George Lowenstein is at Carnegie Mellon, and the aforementioned SDS that Herbert Simon was in. Anyway, so the basic idea we want to think about is kind of to summarize and conclude. We talked about like definitions of behavioral economics, and our different definitions might give us a different perspective on behavioral economics and what it's contributing for us. Then as we're thinking about answering kind of the questions about the purpose of behavioral economics, depending on your perspective, it might be to try to look and see, the limitations of assumptions, or it might be to focus on the predictions. And what we ultimately want to do is actually kind of going back to the original answer, which was like, the goal is to understand economic behavior kind of as well as possible. Right? So ultimately that's what we're going to be after. And I'll provide, as we go through kind of introduction and kind of talk about some of the kind of relevant cognitive biases, and then some of the other relevant contributions from behavioral economics, with the goal of helping us understand the economic behavior that's going to be at the heart of the course. All right, hope you enjoy the video. Go ahead and conclude here.